Dear students, good evening all of you. Today we are going to discuss about the properties of indifference curves and indifference curve analysis in Sugan economics. Dear students, in the previous class we have discussed about the marginal rate of substitution. It is an important tool of studying indifference curve analysis of demand. So now today we are going to discuss about the properties of indifference curves. There are some 5 important properties comes under the properties of indifference curves. So now we will discuss one by one. So the first property of indifference curve is indifference curves slopes downward from left to right. All the indifference curves should slope downward from left to right. So here an indifference curve has a negative slope. An indifference curve has a negative slope. So why an indifference curve has a negative slope? Because of the operation of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. So here it means that when the amount of one good in the combination is increased, the amount of the other good is reduced. So in a combination, if you are increasing one commodity means you have to decrease another commodity. For example, here you take in the first combination. So here in the first combination there is 1 unit of commodity X, here 2, 3. So here you take 12, 8, 3. So here in the first combination 1 unit of X commodity and 12 units of Y commodity, and in the second combination 2 units of X commodity and 8 units of Y commodity, and in the third combination 3 units of X commodity and 5 units of Y commodity. So it means if a consumer is moved from the first combination to the second combination means he is adding commodity X and he is giving off commodity Y, or he is reducing the commodity Y. So here it means when the amount of one good in the combination is increased, the amount of the other good is reduced, because here the constraint to the consumer is the limited amount of income. The income of the consumer remains constant and it is given and constant. Okay. So here then only the consumer will get the same level of satisfaction as before and remain in the same indifference curve. Suppose if a consumer is adding 1 unit of commodity, that is X, at the same time if the commodity Y is also increased or the Y remains constant, it means he is not in the same indifference curve. He will be moved from either the previous one to the second one. So here if the consumer wants to move in the same indifference curve to maintain his level of satisfaction as before, the indifference curve should be sloping downward from left to right. That means if a consumer is adding one commodity means he has to give off another commodity. For example, suppose if the indifference curves are concave instead of convex, if the indifference curves are concave means the consumer, the marginal rate, that is the diminishing marginal rate of substitution will not be applied here. For example, you take the amount of good X is increased in the combination while the amount of good Y remains unchanged. Suppose here we are changing, so here the consumer is increasing the commodity X and keeping remains constant as commodity Y. It means the two combinations will be preferable to the original one and the two combinations will not lie on the same indifference curve. So here in the previous case, if a consumer is adding commodity X means he is reducing commodity Y. But in the new combination, so here the consumer is increasing the amount of good X and he is increasing the commodity X and the combination while the amount of good remains y constant, right? So it means the second combination will be preferable, because here no change in the commodity y, but the consumer is increasing commodity x, so definitely he will get more level of satisfaction as before. So here, but at the same time, the two combinations, the two indifference curves are not, or the two combinations are not lie on the same indifference curve. Are you clear? So in the previous case, the consumer is adding 1 unit of x commodity, means he has to reduce some unit of y commodity, but in the second case, here the consumer is adding commodity x, keeping the combination of keeping commodity y constant. So at that time, here in the second combination, the consumer will be getting more benefit when compared to the previous one. So both the combination will not be lie on the same indifference curve. Dear students, if indifference curve does not slope downward, it should be either horizontal or vertical or upward sloping. So here, but the indifference curves never become horizontal, never become vertical, and never become upward sloping. So why it should not be horizontal one, vertical one, and upward sloping one, that now I will explain. So first you take into account of horizontal. Suppose the indifference curve is horizontal in nature. So here in the diagram, the various combinations, that is various points we have taken P, Q, R and S. So these various points will provide various combinations of increasing quantity of x, keeping the good y as constant. So here you take into account of point P. So here the consumer is having the combination of ON amount of good x and OM amount of good y. Suppose if the consumer move from point P to Q, he has increased his x commodity from ON to ON1, keeping the y commodity as OM. So here, if an individual move from point P to Q or S, the combinations after P, that is Q or S, are giving more amount of satisfaction than the previous combination, that is ON and OM amount of good x and y. So here the consumer is not indifferent. So here, but normally when a point we have taken on the indifference curve, that will provide same level of satisfaction. So but here if you take the points P, Q, R, S on the same indifference curve, but it will not provide the same level of satisfaction. If we move from point P to Q, means the level of satisfaction derived by the consumer will be increased, because he is consuming more of x commodity when compared to point P. So here the consumer cannot be indifferent. So the indifference curve should not be a horizontal one. Then you take into account of the vertical. So here, if you take the vertical curve IZ and the various points we have taken on the vertical IZ curve, that is indifference curve P, Q, R, S, here it denotes that the various combinations which will provide more and more units of y commodity, keeping the commodity x as constant. So here also, when a consumer is moved from point P to Q, this combination is preferable, because the combination Q will provide more level of satisfaction when compared to P, and at the same time you take point R and S, these points are preferable to the other points. So here also the consumer is not getting the same amount of satisfaction when he move from move on the indifference curve, right? So here the consumer is cannot be indifferent. So here the indifference curve should not be a vertical. Now why the indifference curve should not be an upward sloping one? So here if it is upward sloping, the curve will be an increasing one. So here you take into account of IZ. So here it explains the good, both the commodity will increase when a consumer is moved from one point to another point. For example, here we have taken various points P, Q, R and S. So here at point P, the consumer is having the combination of ON amount of good x and OM amount of good y. So now if a consumer is moved from point P to Q, so it means he can increase both the commodities, that is commodity X has increased from ON to ON1 and the commodity Y has increased from OM to OM1. So at point Q the consumer is getting more level of satisfaction when compared to point P, and in the same way you take into account of R and S, the consumer will be benefited more when compared to the previous points. So here also the consumer cannot be indifferent, because when we move along or move on the same indifference curve at any point, that will provide same level of satisfaction, but here the level of satisfaction will be increased, so the indifference curve cannot be slope upward. So you take into account, clear friends, here the indifference curves are downward sloping only. Are you clear? Here the second property of indifference curve is indifference curves are convex to the origin. Indifference curves are convex to the origin. Here you can take our diagram. The indifference curves are convex to the origin. So here, why the indifference curves are convex to the origin? Because it is based on the principle of marginal rate of substitution. So here the indifference curve is relatively flatter on the right hand side and it is relatively steeper on the left hand side. So it means when a consumer is substituting good X for good Y, so at that time the marginal rate of substitution, that is for getting one additional unit of X, the consumer is giving lesser and lesser amount of good Y. So it is because of the diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Suppose if the if the marginal rate of substitution is increasing, instead of decreasing the marginal rate of substitution, if it is increasing, the indifference curve will be concave to the origin. But here you take into account, here at point A, here the consumer is ready to give off AS amount of Y commodity for getting one unit of that is for getting SB amount of commodity X. And here you take for getting an additional 1 unit of X commodity, the consumer is ready to give off only BT amount of commodity Y and TC amount of commodity X. So here the vertical distance goes on diminishing. So here it explains the marginal rate of substitution goes on diminishing. So the indifference curve will be convex to the origin. Are you clear? So here the indifference curves are convex to the origin. It is mainly because of the principle of marginal rate of substitution. Okay. Now you can take into account the third property of indifference curve. So here neither the two indifference curves neither touch nor intersect each other, right? So you take two indifference curve, the two indifference curve are neither touch each other and at the same time it never intersect each other. So if two indifference curves touch or intersect, it will mean that one satisfaction is at the same time greater or lesser or equal to other. Here I will explain the concept, that is why the two indifference curves are neither touch nor intersect with the help of each other. It will be explained with the help of your diagram. So here in the diagram, X axis we have taken good X and Y axis we have taken good Y. So here I have taken two indifference curves. The two indifference curves are intersect at point C. So here you take, this is indifference curve 1 and this is indifference curve 2, but these two curves are intersect at point C. So at this point the level of satisfaction, suppose here the combination to a consumer is OM amount of good X and OS amount of good Y. So here the consumer is both on the indifference curve 1 and at the same time he is on indifference curve 2. So here at this point C, the level of satisfaction derived by the consumer should be equal. Suppose you take a point A, it is on indifference curve IC2, it is a higher indifference curve compared to IC1. So at this point the combination to the consumer is ON amount of good X and OR amount of good Y. So here the consumer is getting more amount of satisfaction than the point C. Suppose you take point B here, it is on the indifference curve IC1, it's a lower indifference curve. So at this point also, here the consumer is having ON amount of X commodity and OQ amount of Y commodity. So at this point, the consumer is getting lesser amount of satisfaction. So here, if the two indifference curves are intersect each other, at one point the consumer satisfaction will be equal for both indifference curve 1 and 2, and in one point the consumer's indifference curve is the consumer satisfaction is greater, and in other point the consumer satisfaction is lesser. So here the two indifference curves are neither touch nor intersect each other. Okay, are you clear? Okay, so here indifference curves are neither touch nor intersect each other. Okay students, so here the fourth property of indifference curve is the higher indifference curve represents higher level of satisfaction. So it means every indifference curve that lies above the right of the other indifference curve represents a greater satisfaction than that of the left. So here in the diagram you can take in the x-axis again we have taken good x and y-axis we have taken good y, and here I have drawn three indifference curves, IC1, IC2, IC3. So here IC1 is the lowest indifference curve and IC2 is a higher indifference curve compared to IC1, and IC3 is a highest indifference curve. So here a consumer is moved from IC1 to IC2 means his level of satisfaction will be increased. That means he is consuming both the commodity more when compared to IC1 indifference curve. For example, you take a point S, it is lie on the indifference curve IC1. So here at this time the consumer is getting this much amount of commodity X and this much amount of commodity, that is at point S the consumer is having the combination or consuming X1 amount of good X and Y1 amount of good Y, and he will get certain level of satisfaction. So now if a consumer is moved from point S to Q, so here Q lies on indifference curve 2, it's a higher indifference curve. So at this point the combination or the consumption made by the consumer on both the goods will be increased. So here now the combination will be X2 amount of commodity X and Y2 amount of commodity Y. So definitely at this point the consumer is consuming more amount of both the commodity, so his level of satisfaction will be increased. So here when we move from a lower indifference curve to a higher indifference curve, our level of satisfaction will be increased. Suppose you take into account of R, it is on the highest indifference curve IC3, so at that point here the consumer is getting again the higher amount of commodity X and higher amount of commodity Y, so that the level of satisfaction derived will be greater. So we can conclude that when a consumer move from a lower indifference curve to a higher indifference curve, his level of satisfaction will be increased and vice versa. Suppose a consumer move from a higher indifference curve to a lower indifference curve, his level of satisfaction will be decreased. So the combination which lie on a higher indifference curve will prefer to the combination which lie on a lower indifference curve, right? Okay, so normally you can take higher indifference curve represents higher level of satisfaction, but you can clear that you take any point on the indifference curve that will provide same level of satisfaction. When you move from a lower indifference curve to a higher indifference curve, your level of satisfaction will be increased, so that we are telling higher indifference curve represents higher level of satisfaction. So now the last point, that is the fifth point, is need not be parallel to each other. So here the indifference curve need not be necessarily parallel to each other, because the indifference curve approach is not based on cardinal utility approach. So here the indifference curve analysis is based on ordinal utility approach, so that we are telling indifference curve analysis, otherwise called ordinal analysis or ordinal utility analysis. So here the marginal rate of substitution between the two commodities need not be same in all indifference curves. So here the marginal rate of substitution is somewhat lesser, and here the marginal rate of substitution will be somewhat greater. So here no need to be the ratio of marginal rate of substitution of indifference curves 1 and 2 are equal. So these are all the 5 points you can remember the properties of indifference curves. So number 1, the indifference curves are always downward sloping. Number 2, the indifference curves are convex to the origin, and number 3, the indifference curves are neither touch nor intersect each other, and number 4, higher indifference curve will represent higher level of satisfaction, and number 5, the indifference curve need not be parallel to each other. Dear students, I think you are all well clear about the properties of indifference curves. If you have any doubt, you can make it in the comment box. Those who are not subscribing Sugan Economics, kindly subscribe and click the bell button so that whenever we are uploading a video, the intimation will be given to you. So thank you friend. Tomorrow we will see with another topic. Thank you friends.